we're going to hit part of chapter 12, and we're going to focus mainly on the protozoa and the helminths. Those are like the parasitic worms, and look at more of the parasitic protozoa as well. And so our objectives here are to look at overall characteristics of protozoa and look at some of the protozoa and the diseases they cause, and then look at what we mean by a intermediate host and a definitive host. Excuse me. So just a reminder of some of the characteristics of protozoa, and these are the animal-like protists. Remember, the protists are divided into the plant-like protists, which are the algae, and the animal-like protists that are the protozoa. And so protozoa are generally unicellular, one-celled. Of course, they're eukaryotic. They belong to eukarya, that domain. Chemoheterotrophic, so they feed on others, but they also feed on, can take in chemicals as well for their food source. They generally live in water and soil for the most part, and they are considered trophozoites, meaning they have a feeding and a growing stage. Okay, so they usually feed on bacteria and small particulate nutrients because they're just kind of usually swimming around in water sources such as ponds and lakes, or they're in soil. And then protozoan means first animal, and so again, that's what makes them the animal-like protists. So when we look at the life cycle of protozoa, they usually can have two different stages to their life cycle. They can reproduce asexually by fission, budding, or schizogony, and schizogony is multiple fission. So that means that the nucleus divides several times before the cell divides, and then cytoplasm surrounds each of those nuclei, and then the cell separates into several daughter cells. So it's almost like they're dividing into a ball of cells rather than just one cell dividing into two, which is what general binary fission is. Some can reproduce sexually through conjugation, and that's when the cells fuse and a haploid nucleus from each cell migrates to the other cell and fuses with the other haploid nucleus. And so that's one way that they can join their DNA and reproduce sexually that way. Some can form cysts. We call it encystment, and it's just a protective capsule that surrounds the organism, and it's almost like an endospore for bacteria. It can allow the organism to survive adverse conditions by forming this protective cyst. It helps parasites survive outside a host. Parasites try to invade a particular host, and they live in that host, gain food, nutrients, a place to live, and so some parasites, if there gets to be enough of them, it can kill the host. Well, that's not generally good for the parasite because then it has to find a new host in order to live. And so sometimes they can form these cysts to survive in between hosts. But generally, a parasite doesn't want to kill its host because, it's getting a free room and board, basically. As far as nutrition, protozoans are heterotrophs. They live in areas with large water supplies generally, and they have a variety of ways of moving and obtaining their food. Those organisms that have cilia, like paramecium, they beat those little hair-like particles back and forth to a mouth-like opening to take in their food. Amoebas, they have these pseudopods, which means false feet. Basically, it's just projections of their cytoplasm that kind of pushes out, so they never have the same shape anytime. They're always changing in shape, but those pseudopods can kind of they kind of look like this, and they can actually surround a piece of food here, and they can keep pushing that pseudopod until it wraps around. It it just keeps wrapping around. And pretty soon they've encapsulated and taken that food. Their digestion occurs in vacuoles that contain enzymes. And then the wastes leave through a plasma membrane. Some of the protozoans can have anal pores, so kind of like an opening to let their wastes out of. As far as their hosts, we can break them down into two parts. A definitive host is the host in which the parasite undergoes sexual reproduction, okay, when it's going to reproduce in them. An intermediate host is the host in which the parasite undergoes asexual reproduction. So, for example, if we look at malaria, the female mosquito is going to inject, it has the parasite inside it. When it bites through the skin, it's going to inject that inside. It's going to multiply in the liver, and then it's going to invade red blood cells and travel throughout. And then it's going to form the male and female gametocytes. And then fertilization and development of the sporocytes in the mosquito stomach occurs. Okay, so inside that mosquito then, that's going to happen. And then they can actually bite the another organism and pass that on. So here are a whole host of protozoans that cause various types of diseases. And so these are some that you're going to get to choose from to research when we do our little research project. For the helminths, these are the parasitic worms. Okay, so we're going to look at what are some basic characteristics of those, what is the life cycle, what are the helminths of medical importance, and then we're going to look at where a human plays a role as being a host to these parasites. So helminths are the microscopic worms. We looked at some roundworms when we did our microscope lab. So these are multicellular, and they're eukaryotic. They're found in kingdom Animalia. They have a digestive system, circulatory system, nervous system, excretory system, and reproductive system. Okay? They're very highly specialized to live inside their hosts. Usually, if they're a parasite, again, they don't want to leave their host organism. So oftentimes, these helminths maybe lack a digestive system, and that's why they need to live inside a host organism, such as in your intestines or something, so they can get food from you. Their nervous system tends to be reduced. Their means of moving around, locomotion, is reduced or lacking, and they have a reproductive system that's complex. And so generally, helminths can have all of these systems, but if they happen to be parasitic ones, they tend to be lacking some of these, and that's why they need a host. Now, the life cycle of a helminth can be dioecious, meaning that the male reproductive organs are in one individual, female reproductives are in another. So you have two different organisms, kind of male and female worms. So di means two. If they're monoecious, I don't know how to pronounce that, or sometimes we call them hermaphrodites, then that one animal has both male and female reproductive organs within the same individual. We generally break down, when we looked at like the roundworms, that slide had both male and female worms, so they belong to the dioecious category. There's two major categories, what we call the platyhelminthes, and these are the flatworms. So things like the flukes and tapeworms are found in this category. I wonder if leeches would probably be found in that category too. I'll have to look that up. Nematodes are the roundworms. This includes heartworm and pinworm, some of those things you might have to treat your pets for, your dogs for, to make sure they don't get that. And so these are some of the different helminths of medical importance as well that you're going to have a chance to research. Now, we can look at arthropods as vectors for some of these parasitic infections. A vector is an organism that transports and passes on the pathogenic microorganisms, and they generally belong to these two categories. They're either arachnids or insects. So arachnids include spiders, but these right here are probably the main ones that pass on some of these parasitic infections, your mites and your ticks. Insects include things like bees, flies, and lice. Flies and lice are probably the main ones that pass on. Things like mosquitoes belong in this one too. Okay, so vectors, any organism that can transmit and pass on a pathogenic microorganism. So these are some of the different arthropod vectors that can help in causing various human diseases. So you're going to get to pick from one of these if you want to do some research as well. So we don't have a lot of notes for this section because a lot of it is going to be you researching some vector, parasitic worm, or parasitic protozoan and finding out what disease it causes and how it's passed on. And is it a human person who is a host, or an animal, or does it spend part of its life cycle in both?